Welcome, everyone. This is Jennifer Armstrong, Associate Director for the National Center for Arts Research, or NCAR, at Southern Methodist University. Thank you for joining us. During this webinar, former BAM President and current NCAR Fellow Karen Brooks Hopkins, along with AMS Planning and Research founding principal Stephen A. Wolf, will share how anchor arts institutions can make maximum cultural, social, and economic impact as they determined through research conducted during Karen's fellowship at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We'll take your questions following the presentations. You have been placed on mute, but please use the chat box for your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later. So with that, I'll turn it over to Karen and Steve.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello, everyone. We're really looking forward to talking to you today about this project, about Mellon research, and about all of the things we have learned over the 2-year period that we have been working on this. So I'm just going to jump in now and begin with our opening statement. I will do my part of the presentation first, and then I will turn it over to my colleague and partner on this project, Steve Wolf. So let me begin by saying that I retired as president of the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 2015 after 36 years working at that institution. Following my retirement, I was invited to serve as the inaugural Senior Fellow in Residence at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And this was amazing because it was an opportunity to actually think rather than just fundraise, 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 and manage the organization every moment, allowing me to focus on the larger field, lessons learned, etc. So this Anchor Cultural Institutions project was the key focus of my fellowship. I would like to acknowledge our wonderful team, Steve Wolf and Melora Seibel of AMS Planning and Research, Bruno Carvalho, co-director of the Princeton Mellon Initiative on Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities, who served as our urbanist humanist on the project. I'd also like to thank Zani Voss and the National Center for Arts Research for providing so much excellent baseline data on our behalf. And of course, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at the Mellon Foundation, Susan Fader, who served as our advisor, and Mariette Westerman, who was in charge of the entire fellowship. So while this project was inspired by my Brooklyn experience, let me make a disclaimer that I did not only concentrate on BAM in this study. We had a wide range of organizations and information that we looked at. But since I did spend 36 years of my life thinking about BAM every minute, please permit me to use that experience there to lay out the groundwork regarding how I approached our key question. So let's return to Brooklyn just for a moment. When I arrived at BAM in 1979, people would say, "Where is such and such a show playing?" And I would respond, "It's at BAM, and then it will travel to London." And the person would say, "Okay, I'll catch it in London." This phenomenon, the unwillingness of so many people to step out of their comfort zone and cross that bridge, inspired me so many years later to think not as a social scientist or a data expert or as an urban planner, but as an arts administrator, about how our field, by emphatically embracing an anchor mission or purpose, can achieve more for artists, our own institutions, and our communities, many of which face challenges and many of which are undergoing drastic change while simultaneously generating more respect for the role of arts in all of society. Everyone on this call is a champion of the arts. We understand their magnitude and how the arts enhances love of learning, generates tourism dollars, brings diverse groups of people together, houses our greatest treasures in our most splendid buildings, how the arts build community, and after all is said and done, art is truly the only thing that endures from generation to generation to generation. And yet our field as we know it, and I particularly refer to the United States, is under-resourced, often undermined, marginalized, and dismissed as elitist and expendable. And that's just the external reality. Internally, we all struggle with lack of funds, the need for committed board members and broader audiences, etc. The full range of problems we have has, to some extent, ratcheted up the competition between our organizations. Large, so-called legacy organizations, as they are known, face substantial costs, huge spaces to fill, significant labor expenses and salaries, but they have tremendous firepower, visibility, and longevity. Smaller and mid-sized organizations offer flexibility, spontaneity, originality, and are often the ones to embrace really tough issues at the most powerful artistic level. But they even have less access to resources, including money, space, equipment, and wealthy board members. So given these problems and the external bias against culture, one might ask, isn't it in our interest to find the best way to work together? It is very possible that when organizations with different and distinct agendas find meaningful ways to partner, the entire community will benefit. This issue of small and large, as you all know, is very political now, and we need to consider how to address it in a way that is not patronizing. Another example of this problem is when dissimilar but collegial not-for-profits, such as the more traditional anchors, universities, hospitals, and our cultural organizations, fail to connect. They are challenged to figure out ways to collaborate, and most of the time, it's not even under consideration. Opportunities are missed, and I believe we can do better. Realistically, as I have said, the financial pressure we face running these organizations is immense and has, to some extent, put us in the difficult position of just getting by, keeping the lights on, paying the staff, and presenting work that we think will generate the maximum revenue, but does it really move our institutions and our communities forward in any dramatic or meaningful way? And for some organizations, there is talk about engagement, but are we really embracing the concept at the deepest and most sincere level, or are we just phoning it in? I believe that going against the grain may help. Rather than taking a conservative position, what does it look like when our organizations go full-on creative? We are the arts, after all. Creativity is our DNA. So for each of the sites that participated in this project, my goal was not only to do the research, but also to articulate and conceive the large-scale, full-blown program idea that would serve as an example or illustration of the anchor role in order to discuss the concept in the largest way. We're all about running well-functioning organizations, but let's talk program and service at the most profound level. We know every community has something unique that gives it character. Anchor mission begins by defining where we are, what's great and what's special about it. Then how can we expand that great thing, maximize that authentic identity, push it through an artistic lens, and make it more powerful and destination-oriented? Can we build a brand that truly connects both locally and beyond? If organizations of all types and sizes embrace the anchor mission in the most profound way, will we emerge as better civic leaders, visionary program providers, and public service purveyors who are also recognized as inclusive and accessible? And will this result in additional attention and resources human, and financial. Steve and I believe that the field is in transition, and we will be talking a lot about that, moving both the narrative and the data from economic impact to community impact, from connected performing arts center to organically connected partner networks. So can we do this? I think so. Let's look at the research. So we're going to begin with some definitions. Here was our key question. How can anchor cultural institutions in low-income areas and communities in transition make maximum social, economic, and artistic impact? We put some definitions together in order to frame the conversation. First, let's start with community. You and I both know that we could spend all day trying to just define community, but for the purposes of this research, we loosely defined for our purposes community as a census place. Examples, City of Providence, Rhode Island, and so forth. We understand that organizational reach is larger and more expansive. Here were our working definitions. Anchor institutions, enduring organizations that remain in their geographic places and play a vital role in their local communities and economies. Anchors generally include colleges, universities, hospitals, libraries, parks, recreation facilities, community foundations, and arts organizations. And for anchor mission, we have defined it as the following: to align core institutional purpose with community values and place-based economic, human, and intellectual resources to better the welfare of the community in which the anchor resides. And thanks to Market Incorporated and the Democracy Collaborative, which has worked a lot in this anchor space, but not especially with cultural institutions, for helping to provide these definitions. So I'm going to look at it now from the BAM experience, and in that context, as we aspire to live the anchor role. Clearly, the map on the side of your screen is a little crazy, so we're not going to go into that in any in-depth way, but it's a mirror of the intensity of these ideas. So first and foremost, as we aspire to live the anchor role, our institutions, we always begin with program. We're arts organizations, we begin with program. Second, speaking in one voice. At BAM, our goal was that the fundraising, the marketing felt like the programming, that everything was in alignment. You will hear this idea coming up over and over again, and I urge you to pay careful and close attention to it. Partnerships, going beyond the basics. I won't go into all of these right now, but I do want to mention a couple of them. Dance Africa Festival is a partnership that began over 40 years ago. It involves performances of African and African-American companies of African dance on the Opera House stage at BAM. An Afrocentric bazaar on the streets around BAM, where more than 50,000 people attend just that aspect of the program over Memorial Day weekend every year. There are films, African films, there are talks, there are master classes, and there is a very in-depth education program with young people from Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation that has been going on for over 20 years. And now, of course, there are Dance Africa festivals all over the United States. It is a remarkable partnership way beyond the basics. Radio Love is a partnership with WNYC New York Public Radio. And again, this was born of an idea that represented a win-win for everyone. These radio programs that are on public radio are iconic. They have a major fan base. They're inexpensive to produce, and they sell out the theaters. It seemed to me that it would be unnatural to form this partnership, hear BAM's name promoted on the radio all the time, and provide an opportunity for public radio to do real fundraising by giving their donors and members a chance to come and see their favorite programs live at BAM year after year. And Muslim Voices, again, a very large and complex program, involved some 20 partners throughout New York City, creating a city-wide festival around the issues of Muslim-based artistic work from throughout the Muslim world. We felt that this was not necessarily going to save the world, but would be a great opportunity for learning. And it included a conference. It included artistic programs from all of our venues. It included exhibitions. It included consulate committees, community committees, a very in-depth partnership around important issues facing all of us today. Removing the obstacles, making room for everybody, diverse entry points, opening up our institutions so that everyone feels comfortable. We know that diversity is not just the right thing to do, it is the most interesting thing to do. And by removing the obstacles and making room for everybody, we become better and more interesting institutions. Visual identity. So many of our organizations are like land of 1,000 logos with too much clutter. At BAM, we tried to generate a powerful visual that exemplifies mission, brand, and promotes destination status, and where there is continuity. At BAM, the idea that everything would have continuity, from the signage on the building to every ad, brochure, postcard, and email communication. And then vision for a 21st century cultural district. We have moved away from the old style defensively based performing arts center that is built off the street and away from its community. And now we look for districts that replicate the energy of their cities in the 21st century. Small and large, ethnically diverse, visual and performing arts, everything mixed up together and next to each other. And then finally, delivering the goods every day, public, private, human, financial, aspiring to live the anchor role. So we had 3 case studies and 3 sites. We wanted to choose different kinds of organizations. We mainly stayed in the Northeast because, not because we had anything against the West Coast or any other part of the country. We just found that it was easier for us to do our work given a limited timetable and limited amount of resources. So we worked with New Jersey Performing Arts Center in Newark, New Jersey, and a large, more traditionally based performing arts center. We liked it because it was metropolitan scale and has not been blanded out by chain store proliferation. They have over 400 events a year and do all different kinds of things. AS220, a smaller, not necessarily traditional anchor as many would see it. A wonderful grassroots organization that does performance, exhibition, has several buildings, unjuried, uncensored, and also in the urban scale of a deindustrialized community in Providence, Rhode Island. And finally, Mass MoCA, a large contemporary museum with an extensive performing arts program in a converted mill factory that just added 130,000 square feet of additional space. Amazing proximity to Williams College and other educational institutions in the Berkshires on a rural scale, but separate from the Williamstown community in that its home-based, North Adams, Massachusetts, is much more of a deindustrialized center, and therefore that creates some additional problems. So those were our 3 sites, but as we talk about these sites and we discuss their role in community, we will never in this study lose sight of the particular role of arts and culture. These are some quotes that I liked and have included them to share with you, but my favorite is the one on the bottom left. Culture is the golden thread that runs across all aspects of urban planning and policy. And now we're going to take a look at some examples of when it works, kind of the best in class of living the anchor role. First, when it works, economic activity. We like this example in Brighton, England. Over 20 festivals have been created in Brighton as an economic development strategy with a full range of content and different points of view. Branding. Obviously, the Museum Mile in New York, Fifth Avenue from 82nd to 105th Street, 7 museums, 1 destination, from the Guggenheim to El Museo del Barrio to the Met. It's an amazing group of museums, and the branding Museum Mile encourages visitation along the full mile of where the action takes place. We also like this example in Birmingham, England, branding, the Jewelry Quarter. This was a dying area that, with encouragement from the City Council, combined over 200 jewelry businesses, sales, manufacturing, galleries, and so forth, to create a destination for this 250-year-old neighborhood. They're showing it, they're making it, they're selling it. It makes sense, a great place to visit, a great place to work, and a great place to live. Again, on the issue of partnerships, and you're going to hear that coming up a lot throughout this webinar. We like this example at the Queens Museum in New York. This is the Immigrant Movement International organization that began as a program at the Queens Museum and now lives at the Queens Museum. This organization has literally changed the composition of the audience for the museum, opened it up, made it more diverse and welcoming, and found a way to mix the more traditional audiences with new audiences and new communities that are located and live in that part of Queens. A very interesting, powerful partnership. Another great partnership that we loved was in Pittsburgh. This city of asylum is a grassroots haven for writers under threat, and they have partnered with the city's cultural organizations to really make a statement. See that house on the left? One of the authors that was housed there during a time when he was looking for a new space in this country, a very controversial topic, yet continuing today, wrote a message as a writer on the outside of that house. That was followed by every writer writing their message and communicating a feeling and a thought that they had. And now the house itself has become a destination and an anchor within Pittsburgh, a place for people to come together around issues that are important and feelings that they have as artists and as visitors and as residents in that city. We love this example in Cleveland, extending the cultural vibe. Cleveland Playhouse Square built this large outdoor chandelier that connects historic theaters, and it says in a very visual way, telling visitors, you are now in a cultural district, a place where art lives. We think that this is a great emblem of living the anchor role. Attracting a crowd. Look what's happened in Detroit, led by the Detroit Symphony and in its Midtown neighborhood. The opening of the Max M. Fisher Center in 2003, an extension of the historic Orchestra Hall, sparked the development of this Midtown neighborhood. New commercial, residential, educational, and cultural facilities are now opening at a pace unrivaled in modern Detroit history. Next, getting involved. We all know about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, something that has been very deeply disturbing, not only to residents, but of course to artists living in that communities. The artists there have gathered together, created documentaries, spoken word performances, generated urban revitalization actions and gallery shows, raising political awareness, assuaging grief, and anticipating long-term educational needs for young people in that community. Even fundraisers have been taking place led by artists where money has been raised to purchase fresh water for residents. Everyone has been encouraged to resume their everyday life with the support of artists leading the way. And of course, revitalizing neighborhoods. Dance Place in Washington, D.C., a smaller anchor, in the Brookland neighborhood of Washington is a perfect example of living the anchor role and reinforces the idea that the anchor space is not just for large legacy institution. Dance Place, as you can see, has a beautiful new revitalized center where they undertake performances and they have great education programs and do many kinds of classes for all ages of attendees. But they also have, in an apartment building right next door, an artist live workspace. They've built an arts park that has many recreational activities and outside activities for young people and residents of the neighborhood right between the two buildings. And lastly, they have Arts on 8th. In their 8th Street retail corridor right nearby, Dance Place is running programs and leading the way, working with the retail owners and residents there. It's a very interesting and terrific strategy for anchor institutions. So all that was the good news, but you and I both know that we have a long way to go. Look at the next set of statistics. This is our ongoing struggle. Tagged as elitist, considered a frill, inconsistent investment, and it all equals lack of respect for the field. Americans for the Arts has proven that the arts generate $166.3 billion in direct expenditure and tax revenue for the United States, and yet combined local, state, and federal sources only appropriate a total of $5 billion to arts organizations. Public arts funding is 15% lower today than it was 20 years ago. And of course, in the US, funding for culture is dominated by private charitable giving. But look at that statistic. Arts, culture, and the humanities received only 5% of all charitable giving in the United States in 2016. So we have to set the context. We are looking beyond economic impact toward community impact. And you'll hear Steve talking a lot more about this as he presents the data. We have to recognize the broad pre-existing realities, complex issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion, so that we can find better ways to work together that are fair and equal. There is a changing definition of success in the field now. Excellence is a given excellence in program. Now we're talking about where do we go from there. Our study is just at the beginning. So as I wrap up my portion, let me just again summarize the way forward. I believe that the field is moving. We started as individual organizations, generally single discipline. And then the field moved to multidisciplinary, big performing arts centers, in addition to the smaller organizations and individual discipline organizations that existed before. And then we morphed into cultural districts that we now see coming up all over the world. I believe that the next space, and the most important and interesting space, will be organically connected partner networks. And we will talk about that as we present the data. And again, what are our key points? Moving from just economic impact studies to community impact studies. Staying power, enduring. We're not leaving. Companies leave, people leave, businesses leave, we stay. Demonstrating value. We must have reasonable data that makes our case in the most professional way. We must invest in powerful and meaningful partnerships that benefit all of the partners and all of our audiences and artists and participants. We must relentlessly engage stakeholders by welcoming everyone. We must lead, as always, with bold, visionary program. And we must join forces with our partners to deliver a unified message. Thank you for your time. I now turn it over to Steve Wolf.
Thanks everybody who's out there hanging in with us. I want to, like Karen, thank the whole team that worked on the project, and I want to acknowledge our partners who are out there in the wild web world with us during this presentation. You know, as Karen mentioned, our goal is to figure out how can anchor institutions build the relationships and partnerships that they need to have to make maximum impact in their communities, particularly social, artistic impact. So in looking at our three different anchors, we saw an intentionally broad variety of organization. Karen summarized the facts about the three of them, but when you try to sum them up in a simple phrase, at NJPAC you have an institution that's focused on engaging different kinds of populations. At AS220, a very citizen-focused organization, and at Mass MoCA, an organization that is much more artist-centric, both in the visual and performing arts space. These organizations couldn't have been more different. They are technically a convenience sample. They're a very, very small sample of just three. But as Karen mentioned, as this is just the beginning of a research effort, in fact, now picked up by Kresge and other foundations, it seemed like a good survey of the landscape. Our process involved collecting data that is not typically brought together in research in the arts sector. We often look at the silo of institutional and organizational data. How many people come? How many tickets do we sell? We often look at who are our partners when we make the case for grant funding. And we certainly spend a lot of time looking at data about our patrons, our donors, our guests, our ticket buyers. But it's very seldom that those are crossed against each other. We conducted a personnel survey, which included board members, staff members, and volunteers at all three organizations. We inventoried partnerships at all three of these organizations. And with the help of NCAR, we looked at each of the markets. What was really interesting is that the three institutions had very, very similar contexts. They were all located in culturally rich areas as defined by the density and the demand for arts and cultural programming, by the supply of people, organizations, and support for arts and culture. Yet they're also all pretty much at the center of areas that are recognized to be on lower levels of employment, income, and educational attainment. This is where our colleague Bruno came into the story and was very, very important in our work. Starting with his quote, the quote from William Faulkner that he shared with us about the past is never dead, it isn't even past. And it's really important, Bruno stressed, that we understand the broad range of sociological and historical issues that define the DNA of these communities where our sites were located. A particular pattern that emerges in all of these communities have to do with urban history and patterns of segregation, social and cultural differences, including where English is and isn't spoken, and of course demographic and socioeconomic data that really generate a three-dimensional picture of each of these communities. We thought we'd share some of the highlights of Bruno's data with you. When we look at poverty levels, what we see is that the poverty levels in each of our three cities are significantly higher than in the surrounding geographies. Wonder what characteristic that is about these cities, and as we start to talk about the intentional de-industrialization, the intentional anti-city movement of the sort of late 1940s, 1950s to the present, we begin to understand these patterns. When we look at median household income in each of these three markets, we see that it lags significantly, yet it's in a culturally vibrant community. When we look at the presence of English as the primary language in the home, we discover in 2 out of the 3 of our sites, it's barely the majority spoken language, suggesting a real need for a willingness and openness to people who are different and proceed through their cultural experiences in a different way. And a particularly important message we learn for our legacy organizations as opposed to the more organic organizations. And then just as a final illustration, the question about home ownership. And home ownership is one of those variables that's been studied significantly more here in the 21st century as an indicator of opportunity and disinvestment in urban places. And these are areas that we're happy to explore with you more. There's a ton of data available, but it sets a pattern. Each of these institutions and many of our major arts and cultural institutions around the country are located in places that were once different than they are now. And as Karen mentioned to us, are still there, very much an anchor in those communities. When we looked at where people came from to visit or to attend performances at these institutions, we discovered that for all three of them, a majority of them lived within 50 miles of the institution, but the big aha for us was that these weren't donuts. I think in many cases, given the nature of the setting of each of these institutions, we thought that perhaps the audiences were going to come from a more affluent, more inclined ring around the urban core. And in fact, what we discovered in all three cases is that anywhere from the top 20% to the top 50% of the folks who were attending the work of these institutions, part of what defined them as anchor institutions, was very significant penetration right in the core of their own community. Another pattern that existed was the presence of one or more major institution of higher education, whether it be university or a college or organizations like RISD and Johnson & Wales, the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, who were not just there, but were vibrant, forward-thinking organizations who were deeply engaged in making community successful, and in each of these cases, in their own way, key partners to the performing arts or visual arts organizations that we studied. One of the biggest findings of the study was the nature of the partnerships in which these institutions engaged. And when we looked at those partnerships carefully, we discovered, in fact, there were two types. There were partnerships directly between the cultural organization and community-based organizations, and there were some 150 different partnerships that were identified. But there were also partnerships with their personnel, their board members, their staff, their volunteers in those community organizations. And each of those anchors, each of those kinds of partnerships, anchor personnel partnerships and institutional partnerships, in fact, overlap, creating real big opportunities for more deep engagement in the community. When we looked at how anchors supported their partnerships, we learned that space, together with activity, were the top resources provided. Now, this is not a surprise. Most of these cultural institutions have significant built infrastructure, and space is something that they can, that they can make available. What was really interesting to us about these partnerships was that in addition to the space, that the organizations themselves were generally driving the programmatic activity. They might not actually be the producer, but they were the facilitator of the outcome. Another thing that we looked at quite deeply was the nature of the relationships that these organizations had in their communities, the types of impacts and networking opportunities that were there. So while we expected that one of the key benefits of these partnerships would be the networking and relationship opportunities that were created, we start to see some differences when we look specifically at the organization. So if you look at NJPAC, you see a significant outcome around local development, engagement, and youth and education. When you look at AS220, you see the community of artists that they're so connected at. And when you look at Mass MoCA, in addition to the sort of community development component, you see general arts involvement and the goal of trying to understand the community that they're in. As we began to understand these networks, we asked the personnel at each of these organizations to describe their organization in 3 words. And when we built the word clouds, what was really, really interesting to us was how different these organizations were, that their facilities, that their economic impact took a back seat to the artistic content that they so put at the center of the organization, as Karen mentioned, and the less measurable and intangible concepts of community, of innovation, of creativity. So when we put all that together, we said, well, this paints a pretty interesting picture. This paints a pretty positive situation, that these organizations are set out to make real impact in the communities in which they're located. But when we actually tested the areas where they make some or great impact, we discovered something very, very odd. While each of the organizations felt that they were central to their city's identity, their role in economic development, their role in employment, civic leadership, even community partnerships lagged far behind other pieces. And these 3 indicators are core, if you will, to the anchor mission, to defining when an organization is actually serving in that larger role. So those are just some really quick illustrations of the types of data we collected, how it can be sorted, and the conclusion that we can draw, which is that anchor institutions aren't yet fulfilling the mission as Karen described it at the outset. So some key takeaways, a suggestion of how we might go forward in the future, and then we'll take your questions if you have any. First and foremost, it's about the opportunity that these 3 institutions illustrated through the partnerships that they're engaged in, the possibility to be even more engaged. The unpolished diamond of these partnerships is all of the places where their personnel, their volunteers, their staff, their board members are also connected in community, which is a natural place to engage. That cultural anchors can expand their impact by thinking about the programming with which they engage community. And Karen talked about sort of the big ideas that might be out there. We were able to demonstrate with the limited data we could collect that external anchors, that external investment would grow when performing arts centers, when museums, when other cultural institutions could demonstrate community impact. Nobody's really sure yet how to measure success, and it's really, really important. In the arts and culture sector, we have limitless anecdotes and amazing stories, but seldom can we demonstrate success with measurable quantitative and qualitative indicators. And the key there seems to be about devoting resources to do so. And then we really think strongly, if you focus on that impact chart, that if you focus on those questions of civic leadership, and how does the cultural institution sit at the important table, you connect the kind of dots that have been connected in the examples that Karen shared with you earlier in the report. And then finally, some things that we could do pretty immediately. We need to track information at the level of the program. How much did we invest? How many people were involved? Who did we serve? What was the intended outcome, and was it achieved? We need to think about how we decide where to invest in our community impact work, in our anchor work, because right now it seems to us, as we measured it, it's based on bandwidth as opposed to evidence. It often is driven by inertia. We've been doing that for a really, really long time. So of course it's valuable. It was interesting to us, the only correlation that we could find among everything from investment, cash investment, to effort, was the number of people involved at the anchor institution. How are those decisions made becomes an important question. And then we did conclude, given the information that was available, that there is no correlation or very little correlation between the amount of dollars invested and the outcome as it relates to the impacts that the anchor has on the community. It's clear to us that the key is about, right now, is about people. how much they care, how much they engage, how much they motivate. And being able to document that and demonstrate that becomes really important. So that's the final part of my presentation. The third part here is how might we measure success going forward? And we think there'll be some good work done, follow-up work done by Kresge, as we mentioned, maybe some others in your communities, and we'd invite you to share stories at the end of the session here. The first thing we need to do is define what a cultural anchor is. And again, with the permission of the Democracy Collaborative, we've adapted some of their work in this notion of what is a definition of a cultural anchor. It's a place-based entity that engages with numerous and diverse partnerships in a variety of ways that bring both crucial and measurable benefits to children, families, and community, as well as our field and beyond. And I think that's another place where we need to look in our work with Marga and with some of the other anchors. We realize that we don't tell our stories sort of beyond our own picture of ourselves. It's really clear to us that anchor institutions are at the front door of a community. Every city we went to, the Convention and Visitors Bureau brochure had our anchor on the front page, and it was a real surprise. Yet they weren't part of the community building strategy. They weren't part of the knowledge sharing network of anchor institutions. So it seems to us that we need to start to gather data in 4 areas. We're good at measuring our economic impact, as Americans for the Arts has done with its arts and economic prosperity studies, but we actually need to be able to demonstrate artist entrepreneurship, that there's the opportunity to work, to live, to make things that engage the arts as part of the community development strategy. We need to demonstrate that we're part of the community building, that we are the speakers platform, the living room for the community, that we're deeply involved with the issues of the day and supportive of cultural awareness and sensitivity. Part of the way to do this is through education programs targeted both at youth and at lifelong learners. The fastest growing population in these cities are back to the city baby boomers who are anxious to engage in the cultural vibrancy of all of these places, and it represent a huge opportunity for us. And then finally, this notion of mission alignment, that it goes beyond the traditional definition of what is the art that we engage or make. It goes more to the institutional purpose, about being a real engaged and vital anchor institution, thinking beyond our programs or our walls, while delivering through really impressive and visionary programs, which each of our 3 anchor institutions were able to do. Finally, we need to engage in measurement. We need to demonstrate how we're working to employ those members of the community in which we are, how we're working to advance their opportunity and capability. We need to be able to demonstrate how we partner with that organization, not just in performance, but in those organizations, the actual business of the community. That's what makes it thrive. And that anchor institutions are deeply engaged in addressing local community issues. And what's really, really important about this is when you read the Funder Network report, you can see that these are places where funders are targeting significant resources, and as Karen mentioned at the very beginning of the study, create opportunity for all of us. So if we start to think about these 4 buckets, would have been a better illustration than squares, but these 4 areas where we can deliver on the anchor mission, then I think when you put that next to phenomenal programs, we have a real opportunity to proceed and succeed. So here, I think we'll turn it back over and take any questions from folks who are out there that have any.
Thanks, Thank you again, Karen and Steve, for sharing this really great and important information. And at this time, if you do have questions, please type them in the chat box and I will read them off. I'll throw one out. Karen, you were talking about when you were describing your experience with BAM and diversity, you talked about obstacles that need to be removed. Do you want to talk a little bit more about when it comes to anchor institutions, what those obstacles might be and how to remove them and what the impact is?
Yes, I thought that the slide particularly about partnerships that showed that the predominant way that we are partnering is through space is a real example of the problem. Now, there's nothing wrong with sharing space or providing space that's discounted or free. Obviously, people need space, but it felt to me, is that the very best we can do? I would like to see mutually beneficial, large scale, or even smaller scale, but deeply thought partnerships where both partners benefit. I've been thinking about things, for example, multi-year partnerships around themes that organizations care about, but that they don't just exist on the most superficial level. They exist to get funding, they exist to create programs that have impact, and then maybe they exist in order to deepen sort of the administrative connection. What about board member exchanges during the periods of time for these partnerships, where, say, the board member from one organization would serve on the others for that period of time, making a contribution and participating, and vice versa. That way we would get into each other's work in a much more in-depth and connected way. And I believe that way we would not only learn more, we would do more. I think that too many of these partnerships are superficial, and that we can succeed in being more diverse up and down the food chain, board members, staff members, artistic presentations, in every way, by looking at the thing more holistically and really trying to consider, how do we live the anchor role in the context of partnerships? How do we serve our local community? And then how do we encourage visitors and become more destination-based? And when we do this in the most interesting way, it is my opinion that we will raise more money, we will make more impact, we will be more powerful. So let me just throw that out there as a way of just continuing the conversation.
Okay, great. We do have a question from Stephen. He says, am I correct in hearing that these organizations thought they were central to the city's identity, but not so central beyond that? They were not good at economic development, employment, or civic leadership? Or is that just perceived impact?
So, Stephen, that's a great question, and you clearly caught on to the subtlety in the slide. So what we asked the question we asked specifically was of personnel about their perceptions of the impacts that the organization had. What's interesting was we then went the next step and said, can we collect data that will either confirm or refute these perceived impacts? And the answer was no, that data wasn't there. In the leadership interviews that we did in each of these communities, the pattern was similar, however. Yes, these organizations are important to our identity and who we are. We cannot tell you whether or not they are driving economic development, whether they are pushing forward increased employment. And we did not have any evidence of formal roles in the civic leadership space. Lots of informal roles, lots of important connections between community leaders and organizational leaders, but a real desire to be more literally present, as other kinds of anchors were. In most of our communities, the hospital leadership, the university leadership was at the civic planning table, was at the economic development table, and the arts organizations, the cultural organizations were not.
This is a very important point in the sense that because of the fact that people know that we are there. Governments understand that cultural institutions are there. Obviously, personnel, board members, everyone understands we are there. But the fact that our own organizations are not really showcasing themselves as civic leaders is an area where we as anchors are, I think, missing an opportunity. And again, it's an opportunity not only for local residents, not only for visitors, not only for artists, it's an opportunity for our organizations to do better, to be more important, and then to garner more resources. The Anchor Institutions Task Force, which has, I believe, thousands of members, has very few cultural members. Another indication that we are not at the table alongside of these other types of anchor organizations, and therefore we are missing a moment to really be as important as we can be.
Okay, we have a question from Meg. They ask if you could speak to how the anchor role intersects with wage equity and workplace-based diversity and inclusion initiatives.
So our data collection in this process was relatively limited. We did collect demographic data on the personnel at all three institutions, and we're very interested to see the broad range of employment opportunities at all three things, both in the staff and the board spaces in particular. At AS 220, the most significantly diverse staff, particularly younger. At NJPAC, a real commitment to employment diversity. And at Mass MoCA, a desire or evidence in their artistic community of really broad outreach. We didn't have data that talked about compensation, so can't answer that part of the question.
Okay, last question. Catherine would like to know more about the interconnected network of groups you're proposing, the new framework beyond the anchor institution, the future of cultural anchor development. Can you describe this further? I think we have a challenge putting human resources toward this given the many demands on our time, and it is difficult to carve out time beyond programs and fundraising and ops.
You know, Catherine, you have hit the nail on the head, and I'm really glad you asked this because, you know, as a fundraiser for my entire career, every time I thought about shrinking the work, shrinking the scope and the mission of the institution because of money, because of time, it really ultimately came back to me that the thing to do was to expand it, that taking on the anchor role, and I'm going to give you a couple examples in just a moment, that growing it would produce more money, more impact. This is the thing. I don't think we should be afraid to embrace the question. For example, when was the last time that our boards, our staff, artists, groups connected to our institutions sat down and had a conversation where we just pushed money aside and said, what does it mean to be full-on creative? If money wasn't a problem, what would we do? What would we do artistically? What would we do administratively? What would we do in terms of our community? What would we do in terms of our region? And I'm not suggesting that we can do all these things, but I think that having conversations like this, the cream would rise and we would do some of these things and then we would be stronger. When I look at cultural districts around the world today, and they're very interesting, you know, in the BAM area, there are 9 organizations right in the core, right around the BAM zone. And then there are 55 or 60 additional organizations as you spread out a little bit geographically. And once in a while, they connect on a particular program or an event. But it is very rare that these organizations speak in one voice. And what I mean is, what would happen, for example, if there were district-wide festivals that had a point of view, if there were district-wide services, such as arts education services or ticket sales services or various services where everyone worked together. I think that these are the ways that we can take the anchor space more seriously. When was the last time that organizations, cultural organizations, worked with the library or the local hospital in a really deep partnership? Many times with universities, we particularly saw great impact when Rutgers Newark worked with New Jersey Performing Arts Center and felt that this was a space that could be pushed and expanded and that would grow and that would raise all boats. So that's what I'm talking about when I say organically connected partner networks. I think they can be local. I think they can be regional. I think they can be I think they can be disciplinary. Festivals like Muslim Voices, which was a citywide festival in New York. I think that they can work in different ways, and that what we can do is to be really imaginative about the issues that we see that are worthy of this kind of engagement, and then engage in them. And I believe we can raise money doing it. We can raise money, we can bring more people, we will get more press, we will do more, we will be more.
I think that another thing that's great about your question is it's the given. There are few not-for-profit arts and cultural organizations that I know of any scale, from a community-based organization to a major international presenter, that aren't resource constrained. So if that's the given condition, the question really is a question about resource allocation. I think that's where Karen was headed, and the question is about balancing a conversation about impact. And we talked about that earlier in the presentation. The notion that excellence is the foundation on which we build, and that bold visionary content is the opportunity that we have. But if the purpose of our work is to have community impact, we really need to think about reallocation of those resources. And the evidence, the anecdotal evidence, because we can't give it to you with factual data yet, suggests that creates opportunities. If you look at AS220 and the expansion of their programs from sort of a gallery and some artist space to almost 7 buildings downtown, 3 theaters, workforce development and training programs. If you look at Mass MoCA and their efforts to engage the downtown Main Street and to reactivate the community as an opportunity yet to come. If you look at NJPAC's involvement in the 350th birthday celebration of Newark as the lead organization, making sure that each and every ward in the city was engaged, and several hundred grants, from micro grants to very significant grants, that NJPAC took the lead to coordinate, not to make, but to help create the resources that hadn't been there before. That's part of the opportunity at the end of this anchor mission.
I mean, bottom line is, we believe, go for the glory, that the key thing to do is to look at what are the most interesting, successful ways to engage. What is the best? What is the best organization that your organization can be? And then those things, taking that and placing it on what is and placing it sort of on top of what's unique and interesting about your community, is where the great things begin to happen. I always felt we lost more money at BAM doing the marginal things rather than the great things, even though the great things, the things that pushed the institution forward, those were the things that often took the most amount of money to do. So it's just a way of thinking that we're trying to encourage here, and one that we think that will really have better long-term impacts for the field at the end of the day.
Well, thank you, Karen and Steve, for sharing your research with us. And thanks to everyone for joining us. If you have questions or feedback about this webinar, you can send them to artsresearch@smu.edu, or you can contact Stephen and Karen directly. Their emails are in front of you. And I hope that you all have a really great week. Bye.
Bye.